The arrival of the students of Sunspire Academy were buzzing with excitement. The air was filled with chatter and laughter as they prepared for the start of another semester. Everyone was eager to meet the new arrivals, especially the students from distant planets. Sunspire was a school like no other one, where the brightest minds from across the galaxy came to learn, grow, and prepare for their futures. But today was different. Today, something unusual was about to happen. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden glow over the Academy's grand entrance, a transport ship appeared in the sky. It was massive, almost too large to fit into the landing zone. The ship hovered silently, its engines humming low and steady. The students who were gathered near the entrance turned their heads as the ship descended slowly, its massive shadow stretching across the Academy grounds. No one had expected this. It was too late in the year for any more new students to arrive, and the Academy had never received a ship of this size before. Whispers spread like wildfire among the students as they exchanged nervous glances. "Who is that?" one student asked, eyes wide. "What's going on?" The ship landed with a soft thud, and the ground trembled just slightly. The hatch on the side of the ship opened with a quiet hiss. For a moment, nothing happened. The students waited in stunned silence. Some of them wondered if this was a mistake. But then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. The crowd fell silent as the figure stepped onto the platform, his boots making heavy, purposeful thuds against the metal surface. He was taller than most humans, and his presence was undeniable. His skin, a dark shade of green, seemed to shimmer under the fading sunlight. His muscles were defined, his body built for strength. His eyes, cold and unblinking, scanned the Academy grounds like he was searching for something. Or someone. He wore a long dark cloak, and his face was partially hidden beneath a hood. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was calculating each step. There was something unsettling about the way he walked. He didn't seem to care about the stares of the students, who watched him with both awe and fear. A group of Academy staff members rushed forward to greet the new arrival. Their faces were tense, and their voices were carefully controlled. The leader of the group, a tall woman with silver hair, stepped forward and bowed slightly. "Welcome to Sunspire Academy," she said in a voice that seemed to shake just a little. "We are honored to have you here." The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply nodded once, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. It was a simple gesture, but it held power. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the entire Academy was holding its breath. Everyone was waiting for something, anything to break the tension. Finally, the figure spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I am here for a reason," he said, his words carrying a weight that seemed to hang in the air. "I do not care for pleasantries." The woman nodded, unfazed by the coldness in his tone. "Of course," she replied. "We have arranged for your accommodations. Please follow us." But the figure didn't move. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the students who were still gathered in the entrance. The crowd parted as if they instinctively knew they should stay out of his way. Some students whispered to each other, eyes wide with curiosity and fear. "Who is he?" someone asked. "What's he here for?" No one seemed to know. His reputation had preceded him, but no one knew exactly who he was. The whispers continued, but the figure didn't pay them any attention. He walked calmly toward the building, the staff trailing behind him. As he passed the students, he gave no sign that he even noticed them. But those who locked eyes with him felt a strange chill run down their spines. There was something unsettling about him, something dangerous. The students were left in stunned silence as the figure disappeared into the Academy's main building. The whispers continued, but no one could make sense of what had just happened. Was he a new teacher? A new student? Or was he something far more important? One student, a young man named Tyler, felt a strange pull in his chest. He had never felt so intrigued by someone before. The man had seemed almost like a shadow, dark, imposing, and otherworldly. Tyler's curiosity burned within him, but he knew better than to approach the man now. It was clear that he was someone important, someone whose presence at Sunspire Academy was not a coincidence. For the rest of the day, the academy was filled with questions, none of which had answers. Who was this mysterious figure? Why had he come to Sunspire Academy? And most importantly, what kind of trouble was he bringing with him? As the day drew to a close, the students continued to whisper about the Deathworlder, the name some had already started calling him. And as the lights in the academy flickered on, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that the arrival of this figure would change everything. The Deathworlder had arrived, and no one knew what to expect next. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again at Sunspire Academy. Unsettling presence. The students of Sunspire Academy continued to whisper in groups throughout the day, but no matter how hard they tried, the unsettling presence of the Deathworlder lingered in the air like an invisible weight hanging over them. As they went about their usual routines, the thought of his arrival gnawed at their minds every step they took. It wasn't just his towering figure that caused unease. It was the strange energy he carried with him, a quiet calm that screamed danger. A deep silence in the midst of the usual academy buzz. The students couldn't help but glance over their shoulders, as though expecting him to appear in the doorway at any moment. Each passing hour felt like a countdown to something unknown. Classes went on as usual, but the air was thick with tension. Every student knew the Deathworlder had arrived, and despite the attempts of the staff to maintain normalcy, no one could truly focus on their lessons. Whispers about his past swirled around the halls. Some said he was a soldier, some said he was an outlaw, but no one knew for sure, and that uncertainty only added to the fear. No one had the courage to speak to him directly, even though he was now a part of their academy. He moved through the hallways like a shadow, his footsteps echoing faintly against the stone floors. Yet somehow no one dared to approach him, or ask who he was, where he came from, or why he was there. Tyler sat in the cafeteria trying to eat his lunch, but every bite tasted bland. The faces of his friends blurred around him as his thoughts remained focused on the figure who had disrupted the flow of their peaceful academy life. The Deathworlder wasn't someone to be ignored. His every movement felt calculated, like he was always watching, always waiting. The silence he carried with him was deafening. If he knew something, they didn't, as if he was waiting for the right moment to speak or make a move. Tyler's eyes scanned the room, and there he was standing in the corner of the cafeteria, near the windows, watching the students with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. It wasn't a threatening gaze, not in the usual sense, but it was cold, calculated, as if he could see through every person in the room and understand exactly what they were thinking. The staff continued to act as if everything was fine, but the students were more aware than ever that something wasn't right. No one had seen him speak to anyone. Beyond the staff, he didn't join in any conversations. He didn't look for friends. He simply existed within the walls of Sunspire Academy, like an island in a sea of confusion. The students didn't know how to feel about him. Part of them feared him, part of them felt an undeniable curiosity that only grew with every passing moment. But no one dared to get too close. No one dared to test how dangerous his silence truly was. Tyler's eyes met the Deathworlder's for a brief second before quickly looking away, the coldness in those eyes sent a shiver down his spine. The Deathworlder didn't seem to blink, not once. His gaze never wavered as he stood still in the corner, like a statue, silently observing the room. Tyler felt a knot form in his stomach but couldn't tear his gaze away. It was as though the Deathworlder was calling to him somehow, pulling at his very soul. The feeling was almost magnetic and terrifying at the same time. It wasn't until later that evening that the students learned more about the strange arrival. The academy had sent out an official notice explaining that the Deathworlder was not a student, nor was he a teacher. He was here on a special assignment, an assignment that required him to be a part of Sunspire Academy for an undisclosed amount of time. The details were vague, but the implications were clear. The staff weren't saying much, but the few who knew him were careful not to speak his name aloud in front of the students. It was as if speaking his name would give him even more power over them, and the students couldn't help but feel the weight of that unspoken truth. Deathworlder was here for a reason, but no one knew what that reason was not yet anyway. The students tried to go on with their lives, but it was clear that nothing would be the same. They could feel it in the air, a sense of unease that wouldn't go away, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it. The Deathworlder had arrived, and now Sunspire Academy would never be the same. The question was not whether he would fit into their world, it was whether their world was ready for him. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest as the evening shadows grew longer. The feeling of unease only deepened, and he couldn't shake the sense that something far bigger was at play, something dark and dangerous that had begun the moment the Deathworlder stepped onto Academy grounds. No one knew who he was, no one knew his intentions, but one thing was certain: the students of Sunspire Academy were about to face something they could never have, a dangerous encounter. The next morning, the Academy was filled with tension as the students tried to carry on with their routines, but there was something different in the air, something that made every footstep seem louder, every voice echo more sharply, as though the very walls of the school were aware of the strange presence that had arrived among them. Whispers of the Deathworlder circulated with increasing intensity. Students avoided the areas where he was likely to be seen, while others exchanged fearful glances when they spoke of him. Most of all, they wondered why he had come to Sunspire Academy, what was his purpose, and what did it mean for the future of their peaceful world. At lunch that day, a group of senior students gathered around a table at the far side of the cafeteria. The conversation was hushed but filled with excitement. One of them, a tall, confident young man named Gregor, had been the first to speak out about the Deathworlder the night before. "I say we challenge him," he said, his voice low but filled with a dangerous kind of excitement. "We've heard the stories, right? He's some kind of warrior, a soldier from a death world where only the strongest survive." Gregor's friends nodded in agreement, their eyes glinting with the same thrill they had felt when they first heard the rumors about the Deathworlder. "Let's see if it's true," Gregor continued, his voice filled with bravado. "Let's put him to the test and see just how tough he really is." The idea was reckless, but Gregor's friends were too, intrigued by the idea of facing off against such a legendary figure. To resist, they weren't afraid of the stories they had heard. They had trained their whole lives to become the best. They weren't afraid of any challenge, no matter how dangerous it might be. And if they could prove themselves by taking down someone like the Deathworlder, well, then they would become legends in their own right. After lunch, the group of students made their way to the training halls where they knew the Deathworlder was likely to be. They had carefully watched him for days and knew his schedule better than anyone else. They had seen him practice his techniques alone, late in the evenings, his movements precise and fluid like a deadly predator hunting its prey. They had seen the way he carried himself with such calm confidence. It was both terrifying and fascinating, but now they were ready to test him. As they entered the training hall, they saw him standing in the center of the room, his back turned to them. He was already dressed in a simple training suit and holding a wooden staff. His posture was relaxed, but there was an undeniable strength in the way he stood. It was as though the very air around him bent to his will. His movements were slow but deliberate, as though he could sense their presence before they had even entered the room. Gregor stepped forward with a smirk on his face. "We've heard a lot about you," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "You're the Deathworlder. They say you're unbeatable." The Deathworlder turned slowly, his cold eyes locking onto Gregor's with a gaze that felt like it could pierce straight through him. There was no emotion in his eyes, no hint of a smile, just an unblinking stare that sent a chill through Gregor's spine. "I don't want trouble," the Deathworlder said, his voice low and gravelly, but carrying a weight that made every word feel like a command. "I'm here to teach, not to fight." Gregor laughed dismissively. "We just want to see for ourselves if you're as tough as they say," he said, stepping closer. "A friendly sparring match, that's all." The Deathworlder's expression remained unchanged. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Gregor's face. "You won't like the outcome," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper, but the authority in his words was enough to make even Gregor hesitate for a brief moment, but only for a moment. The arrogance in his eyes didn't let him back down. "I'm not scared of you," Gregor said with a grin. "Let's see if you're as good as they say." The match began with Gregor charging forward, his movements fast and precise, but the Deathworlder's reaction was even faster as Gregor swung his staff toward him. Deathworlder dodged with ease, stepping to the side and grabbing Gregor's wrist with a speed that made the younger student's head spin without a word. The Deathworlder twisted his arm with a swift motion and sent Gregor crashing to the floor with a resounding thud. Students watching gasped in shock. They had never seen anyone move that fast. They had never seen anyone take down Gregor so effortlessly. Gregor scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "You cheated," he yelled. But the Deathworlder remained silent, his gaze unwavering as he prepared for Gregor's next attack. Gregor lunged again, this time with even more force, but it was clear he wasn't prepared for the Deathworlder's skills once more. The Deathworlder sidestepped the attack with a simple movement, and in one swift motion he knocked Gregor's staff from his hands, sending it spinning across the room. Gregor stumbled back, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his balance, but the Deathworlder wasn't done yet. With a single push, the Deathworlder sent Gregor tumbling back to the floor again. Gregor lay on the ground, breathing heavily. His pride shattered, his body aching. The other students who had gathered around stood in stunned silence, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. No one had expected the Deathworlder to be this skilled, this powerful, and certainly no one had expected him to dispatch Gregor so easily. The Deathworlder stood over him for a moment, his gaze cold and calculating. "I told you," he said softly. "You don't want this fight." With that he turned and walked away, leaving Gregor lying on the floor in defeat. The room remained silent for a long time as the other students processed what had just happened. It was clear now that the Deathworlder was not someone to be trifled with. He was not just a myth or a story. He was real, and he was powerful in ways they had never imagined. Tyler watched the scene unfold from the sidelines, his heart racing with a mixture of awe and fear. He had known there was something dangerous about the Deathworlder, but seeing him in action made everything feel so much more real and so much more terrifying. There was no doubt now that the Deathworlder was not someone they could ignore. He was here for a reason, and no one knew what that reason was yet. But Tyler was beginning to understand just how important the first lesson. The following day, the academy was buzzing with anticipation. Something about the Deathworlder had shifted in the students' minds after the sparring match. It was no longer just curiosity or fear. It was respect, something deeper, something raw that made them pay attention even more than before. For the first time in days, the students found themselves waiting eagerly for his next move. They didn't know what to expect, but they knew they would be watching closely. The moment the clock struck noon, the academy's training hall would be his stage. Tyler stood in the back of the hall, along with the rest of the students, his heart racing as he watched the Deathworlder enter the room. He was different now, not just an unknown figure, but a teacher, a challenge, a force to be reckoned with. Every student in the room knew they would be tested today in ways they hadn't anticipated. The Deathworlder moved to the center of the room with the same calm, methodical pace as before, his eyes scanning the room like a hunter watching his prey. No one dared to speak as he stood before them with a staff in his hands, a simple weapon, but the way he gripped it made it clear that it was far more than just a tool. It was an extension of himself, a part of his very being. Students shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, waiting for him to speak, but he didn't. Instead, he motioned for them to begin their training with a single hand raised up, as though expecting them to follow without question. And they did. The class began in silence, each student carefully moving into their positions to begin the drills that had been assigned. But there was something different about today's lesson, something that felt more intense, more real than the usual training they were used to. Move quickly. The Deathworlder's voice cut through the silence. like a blade, each word carrying weight, as though the room itself obeyed his command without hesitation. Every step you take should be calculated. Every move should be precise. If you hesitate for even a moment, you will fall behind. You will be weak, and your weakness will cost you. The students began to follow his instructions with more urgency, but it wasn't enough, not for him. The Death Worlder's eyes swept across the room, and then he moved suddenly, and without warning. One moment he was standing still, the next he was at the far end of the room with a single leap. His speed was unreal, his movements fluid and deadly, and before any of the students could react, he had already completed the drill. They were still fumbling with their own movements as he stood there, waiting for them to catch up. "Faster," he said simply, his voice cold, but not unkind. The students pushed themselves harder, but the gap between their efforts and the Death Worlder's precision seemed impossibly wide. His pace didn't slow, it didn't falter. It was relentless and unwavering. "You will not reach your potential if you do not push yourselves beyond what you thought possible," he added, and his words hit harder than any drill could. His eyes locked onto each student individually, as though reading their very souls. Tyler couldn't help but feel overwhelmed as he tried to keep up. His body felt like it was moving in slow motion compared to the Death Worlder. His arms burned from the effort, his legs ached, but it wasn't just the physical strain that was getting to him. It was the weight of the Death Worlder's expectations, the pressure to be better, to do more, to push past every limit they had ever known. It was a feeling unlike anything he had ever experienced before. It wasn't long before the Death Worlder noticed Tyler's struggle. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and then without a word he was at Tyler's side in an instant, his movement so fast it was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. "You hesitate," he said, his voice low and firm. "You're holding back." Tyler's breath hitched in his throat. He hadn't expected the Death Worlder to focus on him specifically, but now that he had, he didn't know what to say. He was out of his depth. "Think too much," the Death Worlder continued, his words like ice. "You calculate your next move instead of feeling it. You rely on your mind too much when you should be trusting your instincts." Tyler swallowed hard. The words stung, but they were true. He had always been a thinker, always analyzing every move before he made it, but now it was clear that wasn't going to be enough. Not in this class, not with this teacher. The Death Worlder raised his staff, and in a single motion, he demonstrated the technique the class had been struggling with earlier. He moved effortlessly through the steps, each action seamless and perfect. It was like watching a dance, but there was no grace, only precision and power. The staff spun through the air like an extension of his will. No hesitation, no fear, no thought, just action. Tyler could barely keep his eyes on the staff. It moved so fast. "Try again," the Death Worlder said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a command. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest as he gathered his strength. He had to focus. He had to stop thinking too much and just move with the rhythm of the training. He raised his own staff and followed the movements the best he could. His body was still stiff, his movements jerky, but this time he didn't hesitate as much. He let his instincts take over. The Death Worlder watched him closely, then nodded once, his approval subtle, but they're nonetheless better, he said, and for the first time in Tyler's life he felt like the Death Worlder wasn't just testing him, he was teaching him. He wasn't breaking him down for sport. He was pushing him to discover something new, something deeper about himself, and the others in the room began to notice too as they pushed through their own struggles. The atmosphere in the hall began to shift. It wasn't just about learning the moves anymore. It was about understanding their limits and pushing them until they broke. It was about surviving in a way they had never been taught before. By the end of the session, Tyler felt exhausted. Every muscle in his body ached, but there was a strange sense of satisfaction, a feeling of having accomplished something he had never thought possible before, and he wasn't the only one. The rest of the class shared the same look of quiet realization. They had been changed today. They had glimpsed something greater than just a training exercise, something beyond what they had imagined before, and they all knew it was because of the Death Worlder's teachings. As the class ended, the students slowly filed out of the hall, but there was no chatter, no excitement, only a quiet understanding that they had been part of something important, something that would stay with them Long after the day was over, and as Tyler walked out with the others, he couldn't help but wonder what the Deathworlder would teach them next, and what kind of lessons they would learn as the days went on, because he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, it would change everything. A glimpse of the past days passed at Sunspire Academy, and while the students had grown accustomed to the Deathworlder's presence, there was still an air of uncertainty that lingered around him. It was as if he was constantly surrounded by an invisible wall that kept everyone at a distance. No one dared to approach him beyond the strict confines of the classroom, and while some students whispered about him in the halls, no one ever dared to ask him directly about his past, about where he came from, or why he had been sent to the academy. But that didn't mean they weren't curious. Tyler found himself increasingly drawn to the Deathworlder. It wasn't just his skill or his presence that intrigued him, but the mystery that surrounded him. Tyler had spent countless hours trying to piece together the fragments of rumors and whispers that he had heard from other students, but they never seemed to fit together. There were too many questions and no answers. It was as if the Deathworlder's past was a puzzle that no one could solve. But Tyler wasn't like the others. He couldn't let it go. He had to know more. One evening, after class, as the rest of the students filtered out of the training hall, Tyler stayed behind. His heart raced as he waited for the Deathworlder to finish his practice. He had watched the man perform the same intense drills for days now, and he had never once seen him falter. His movements were always precise and deadly. Tyler knew that tonight he couldn't leave without getting closer to the truth. As the last of the students filed out of the hall and the doors clicked shut behind them, Tyler made his move. He waited until the Deathworlder's attention was momentarily diverted, and then he stepped forward cautiously. The Deathworlder turned to face him, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he had known Tyler was there the entire time. "You're not supposed to be here." His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it that made Tyler hesitate for a moment. But the curiosity inside him was stronger than the fear. I just wanted to ask," Tyler began, his voice quiet but determined. "I want to know more about you, about where you came from." For a long moment, the Deathworlder said nothing. He simply stared at Tyler as though weighing his words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice softer now, but still laced with an undeniable power. "You are not the first to ask," he said slowly, his gaze never leaving Tyler's face. "And you will not be the last, but know this: the more you learn, the more you may regret knowing." Tyler swallowed hard, the weight of the Deathworlder's words settling over him like a heavy cloak. "I don't care about the consequences," he said, his voice firm with resolve. "I just need to understand." The Deathworlder's expression remained unreadable, but Tyler could see something flicker in his eyes, a momentary flash of something deeper, something that hinted at a past filled with pain and loss. With a slow movement, the Deathworlder gestured for Tyler to follow him as he moved to a corner of the hall near a small table that held a collection of strange devices and artifacts. Tyler's curiosity piqued as he followed the man and watched him carefully begin to assemble something that looked like an old communication device. It was unlike anything Tyler had ever seen before. The technology seemed both ancient and advanced at the same time, with strange markings that glowed faintly along its surface. "Where did you get that?" Tyler asked, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "It looks like nothing I've ever seen." The Deathworlder's gaze shifted to the device for a brief moment before his eyes met Tyler's once again. "This," he said simply, "is from my past, from a time I no longer wish to remember." Tyler felt his heart beat faster as the Deathworlder's words sank. And there was more to this man than anyone could imagine, more than just a warrior or a teacher. A darker story that had been hidden from the academy for a reason, and yet despite the warning in the Deathworlder's voice, Tyler couldn't stop himself from wanting to know more. "What happened?" Tyler asked quietly, unable to resist the pull of the question. The Deathworlder took a deep breath, his eyes closing for a brief moment, as if recalling memories that he had long tried to bury. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, less controlled, but still carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. I was once part of an elite force trained to fight wars that no one else could survive. We were sent to planets where no one else dared go, places where death was the only certainty. But we survived, we fought, we became something different. Tyler listened intently, his mind racing as he tried to process what the Death Worlder was saying. The pieces were slowly falling into place. The man before him was no ordinary fighter. He was a soldier, a weapon forged in the fires of war. And what happened? Tyler asked, his voice barely a whisper. The Death Worlder's eyes flickered with a hint of something old and painful. We won battles that no one thought possible, he said, his voice distant. But at what cost? In the end, it was not the enemy that defeated us, it was ourselves. Tyler could feel the sorrow in the man's words, the regret that seemed to seep from his very being, but he didn't understand what it all meant. Not yet. I left that life behind long ago, the Death Worlder continued, but it is not something that can ever truly be forgotten. There was a long silence as the Death Worlder turned his attention back to the device in his hands. He seemed to be lost in his thoughts, but Tyler couldn't let the moment pass without asking one final question. Why are you here? He asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the moment the Death Worlder had arrived at the Academy, the question that had never been answered. The Death Worlder's gaze met Tyler's once more, his eyes dark and unfathomable. I am here because it is the only place left where I can find redemption, he said, his voice low but filled with an unspoken meaning. But even here I cannot escape what I have done. And with that, the Death Worlder turned away from Tyler, his focus shifting back to the device in his hands. Tyler stood frozen in place as the weight of the Death Worlder's words washed over him. He had glimpsed a part of the man's past that few others had seen, and though the mystery was far from solved, Tyler understood one thing clearly. The Death Worlder was no ordinary being. He carried a history that shaped him in ways no one could imagine, and that history had brought him to Sunspire Academy for reasons that were far from simple. Dark secret. The days following his conversation with the Death Worlder left Tyler unsettled in a way he hadn't expected. There were pieces of the man's past that didn't make sense, and yet the more Tyler thought about them, the more he realized just how little anyone at Sunspire truly knew about the Death Worlder. His words still echoed in Tyler's mind, the promise of redemption, the weight of his actions, but the truth was that no one at the Academy had any real understanding of who he truly was or what had brought him to their doorstep, and even the staff remained tight-lipped about his arrival. It was as if everyone was guarding a secret that Tyler was determined to uncover. It wasn't long before Tyler's curiosity got the best of him once. Again he found himself walking through the quiet halls of the Academy late one evening after most of the students had retired for the night. His thoughts were a blur as he moved through the familiar corridors, the words of the Death Worlder still tugging at his mind, and as he walked past the training hall, something caught his eye, a faint light shining through the cracked door. The sound of footsteps echoed inside, and though he had no real reason to do so, Tyler found himself opening the door just a crack inside. The Death Worlder stood in the center of the hall, his back turned to the door. As he practiced his movements with a speed that Tyler could barely keep up with each strike of his staff was a blur of motion and power, his focus unyielding. But it wasn't the movements that caught Tyler's attention, it was what was on the floor near the Death Worlder's feet, a small device that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Tyler couldn't make out what it was, but he could tell it wasn't a typical piece of equipment used for training. It was something more, something important, and it was unlike anything he had ever seen before. He took a step closer, quietly holding his breath as he observed the scene before him. It was then that the Death Worlder spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. You're here because you want to know more. His tone wasn't harsh, but it held an unmistakable edge. Tyler froze, his heart racing as the Death Worlder turned to face him, his cold gaze piercing through the darkness. You've been watching me long enough. The Death Worlder continued, his voice steady, but there was a hint of something deeper in it now, something that Tyler couldn't quite place, but it made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Tyler didn't know what to say. The words he had prepared earlier felt meaningless in the face of the Deathworlder's unwavering gaze. But he knew he couldn't back down now, not after everything he had learned so far. I just need to understand," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I need to know what you've been hiding." For a long moment there was silence between them. The only sound was the faint hum of the device on the floor, and the soft echo of Tyler's breath in the still air. Then slowly the Deathworlder stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Tyler's face. "You think you want to know the truth," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But the truth is something that cannot be undone. Once you see it, once you hear it, there's no going back." Tyler stood his ground despite the growing unease that filled him. There was something almost ominous in the Deathworlder's words, but he couldn't stop himself from wanting to hear more. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firmer than he felt inside. "I need to know what brought you here, why you're at Sunspire Academy." The Deathworlder stared at him for a long moment, before slowly bending down to pick up the glowing device from the floor. It seemed to pulse with a faint energy, and as he held it in his hand, Tyler noticed something strange about it. The markings along its surface were familiar, but unlike anything he had ever seen before. They were like an ancient script, a language that seemed to be both alive and dead at the same time. "This device," the Deathworlder began, his voice low and filled with an emotion Tyler hadn't expected, "is a remnant of my past, a key to a war that has long since ended." Tyler's heart skipped a beat at the words. War was a word he had only heard in the context of the stories the Deathworlder had shared, but hearing it from him now gave it a weight that made Tyler's blood run cold. "The war I fought in was not one that the galaxy remembers," the Deathworlder continued. "It was a war that was erased from history, a war fought in the shadows where the truth was buried by those who wanted to forget." The Deathworlder's gaze turned distant as he looked at the device in his hand. "I was part of an elite force sent to eliminate threats that no one else could face, and in the process, we became the very things we were meant to destroy." His voice faltered slightly as though the weight of the memories was too much to bear. "We were used as weapons by those who didn't care about the lives we destroyed or the lives we lost." His hand clenched around the device, his fingers trembling just slightly. "I never had a choice in any of it." Tyler's heart sank as he listened to the Deathworlder's words. The man before him wasn't just a soldier, he wasn't just a warrior. He was someone who had been forced into a role he never wanted, someone who had been used and betrayed by the very people who had sent him to fight. And the more Tyler listened, the more he realized that the Deathworlder's past wasn't just filled with battles and victories. It was filled with regret and loss, a dark secret that he had carried with him for far too long. "The war is over," the Deathworlder continued, his voice quieter now. "But the scars remain. The lives we destroyed can never be undone, and the choices we made can never be erased." He looked at Tyler, then his eyes hardening with something akin to resolve. "And yet I am here to try and find redemption, to learn what it means to be something more than just a weapon." Tyler stood frozen in the darkness as the weight of the Deathworlder's words settled over him. He had uncovered something that no one else at the Academy knew, something that no one else had ever dared to ask, and now he understood why the Deathworlder was here. Not just to teach, but to atone for a past that would never let him go. And as Tyler left the training hall that night, the truth weighed heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't forget what he had learned, but he also knew that it wasn't over yet. Something darker was still coming, something that tied directly to the Deathworlder's past, and Tyler was beginning to realize just how dangerous it could be. For everyone at Sunspire Academy, the unseen threat. The following days were filled with a quiet tension that seemed to settle like dust over Sunspire Academy. The students continued with their classes, but something had changed. The Deathworlder's presence loomed over them like a storm waiting to break, and Tyler could feel it in every moment, the weight of the past, the secrets. The Academy had worked so hard to hide it. It was all coming to a head, and the closer Tyler got to the truth, the more he realized that the real danger was not in the Death Worlder himself, but in the shadow of his past that followed him wherever he went. It started with small things at first, the faintest shifts in the Academy's atmosphere, the way the air seemed to grow heavier as the days passed the way. The staff had become more vigilant, whispering amongst themselves when they thought no one was listening, but it wasn't until Tyler overheard a conversation between two of the senior professors that he realized just how serious the situation had become. "It's not safe anymore," one of them said, his voice shaking with fear. "We've been warned," the other replied just as quietly. "The Death Worlder's enemies know where he is. They're coming for him, and for all of us." Heart raced as the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always known there was more to the Death Worlder's past than anyone had let on, but he hadn't realized just how dangerous it truly was. Whatever this war was, whatever dark forces were still hunting the Death Worlder, they were closing in on Sunspire Academy now, and Tyler could sense that it wasn't just the Death Worlder they were after. It was something much bigger, something tied to the very foundation of the Academy itself. The days that followed, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The halls of the Academy no longer felt safe. The once calm and peaceful corridors now seemed like a labyrinth filled with hidden dangers. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every passing moment seemed to stretch on forever, as though time itself was working against them, and no one seemed to know just how close they were to the storm that was about to break. It wasn't until late one night that the first sign of the impending danger came. The Academy was thrown into chaos when a loud explosion rocked the outer perimeter of the campus. The ground shook violently, and the sound of the blast echoed through the entire Academy, sending students and staff scrambling for cover. Tyler rushed out of his dormitory and into the courtyard, his heart pounding in his chest as he searched for any sign of what had happened. The air was thick with smoke, and the night was alive with the sounds of alarms and shouting. The Academy was under attack. The Death Worlder appeared in the center of the chaos, his silhouette cutting through the smoke as he moved with a speed and precision that no one could match. He was already in full combat mode, his eyes scanning the surroundings with deadly focus. The students around him were frozen in fear, but Tyler watched in awe as the Death Worlder moved effortlessly through the chaos, taking control of the situation with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. He was not just a soldier. He was a protector, someone who had seen and survived the worst of battles, and now it was clear that Sunspire Academy was about to face one of those battles firsthand. Tyler's eyes darted around the courtyard, looking for any sign of the attackers. But there was nothing visible. The air was thick with tension, but the enemies were hidden, their presence felt but not seen. Then, suddenly a figure emerged from the smoke. It was a shadow at first, but as it drew closer, Tyler's heart skipped a beat. The figure was wearing dark armor covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. They moved with purpose, their steps deliberate, as they approached the Academy's main building, and Tyler realized with a shock that these were no ordinary attackers. They were soldiers from the Death Worlder's past. The Death Worlder didn't hesitate. He moved forward with a single fluid motion, his staff raised high as he closed the distance between himself and the soldiers. In an instant, the sound of combat filled the air, the sharp clash of metal against metal, the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground, and Tyler stood frozen in place, watching as the Death Worlder fought with a ferocity he had never seen before. His strikes were like lightning, fast and precise, his movements a blur as he dispatched his enemies with ruthless efficiency. But even as the Death Worlder fought off the soldiers, Tyler could see that this was only the beginning. More figures emerged from the smoke, their armor gleaming with deadly intent. It was clear now that the Death Worlder's enemies were not just here for him. They were here to destroy everything he had built, everything he had tried to protect. And Tyler realized with growing horror that Sunspire Academy had become a battleground for a war that had been raging long before he had ever set foot there. Death Worlder's eyes met Tyler's for a brief moment, and in that instant Tyler understood everything. The Death Worlder had been hiding the reasons he had come to the Academy, the reasons he had never allowed anyone to get too close. It wasn't just a matter of redemption or atonement, it was survival. He had brought his enemies with him to Sunspire. academy, and now the students were paying the price for his past mistakes. As the battle raged on around him, Tyler felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. But he knew one thing for certain. The academy was no longer a place of peace, it was a fortress. Under siege, and the storm that had been brewing for so long had finally arrived. Tyler wasn't just a student anymore, he was part of the fight whether he liked it or not, and as the Death Worlder fought to protect them all, Tyler couldn't help but wonder how much longer they would be able to hold out against the enemies of the past, how much longer they could survive in a war that no one had prepared them for, and what the true cost of their survival would be.